Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Deep Humanism. This is our second episode of Two Humanists with me, James Croft, and Andrew Copson, who is Chief Executive of Humanists UK. How are you doing this week, Andrew?
I'm doing very well. I'm a little bit awkward if I don't move my hands around quite as often as I do. It's because I've got a dog on my lap, and she won't let me
Oh,
move my hand. But I'm well and warm.
viewers are meeting Juno possibly for the first time. How's Juno doing?
She's okay. Very firmly clamped down on my lap. It's a bit cold out there. I don't know if it's cold where you are. It's freezing here.
It's freezing in Brighton, and it's lovely to see that you have a living water bottle there for you so that you can be
Yeah,
warm. It's a little heat battery. So on Two
she
Humanists,
really
we
is.
choose two topics. We give two views on those topics. And this week, the topics are JD Vance's speech to the Munich
Oh,
Security Conference and
oof.
Darwin Day, which happened on 12th of
Hooray.
February. So between this recording and our last one, I thought we would start with the less fun one so that we'd talk about JD Vance first. And I thought I'd give people some background in case they don't know who JD Vance is. Not everybody watches politics as closely as we do. So, just in
Mm.
case you need some catching up, JD Vance is the Vice President of the United States under Donald Trump. He was previously a senator from Ohio from 2023 to 2025, so not in politics very long before his sudden elevation to the vice presidency. He was well known as an author of a book called Hillbilly Elegy. You may have seen the film that was made out of that not too long ago. And he's interesting as a sort of political chameleon. He first opposed Donald Trump. He was a never Trumper and saying that Trump should never be the nominee for the Republican Party, and then has sort of migrated to becoming a kind of post-liberal rightist. And the reason why he's on everybody's minds this week is because he gave a talk at the Munich Security Conference, which calls itself the world's leading forum for debating the most pressing challenges in international security. So it's a place where high ranking international decision makers go to talk about world security, so heads of state and government, ministers of defense, etc. And Vance was an invited speaker at this event. He gave a speech in which I just watched it in its entirety in preparation for this conversation. It's a depressing speech, but the basic outlines of this, tell me if you agree, Andrew, are that the greatest threat to European security is not external dangers like China and Russia, but actually internal dangers, particularly the decay of commitment to democratic norms and freedom of speech within European states themselves. And that's what he said.
Well, I think that's putting it a bit generously, actually.
I did
I
it
think you had
nicely, did I?
you've had to do a lot of work to reinterpret what he said to be an actual concern for democratic values. Um, because I had the misfortune to watch it live. It happened to be at the same time I was having my lunch, whatever day it was it Thursday or Friday, whenever it was, and turned on Sky News as I often do when I'd made my sandwich just to give myself some indication of what was going on. And there he was making this speech live, and you know, I I did find it genuinely shocking as a speech, as an intervention into current discussions, and I think I'm still processing it, to be completely honest, inside, thinking about what um, what it might all mean, and what he was really saying. Because you said that he said he was concerned with democratic values. I don't think that's right at all. I think he was sketching out a very undemocratic manifesto, because he was saying things like, um, "Oh, you." First of all, it was he was scolding. I mean, he was hectoring and
Yes.
high-handed. He was talking directly to European and NATO allies, so it was an odd tone. It was a very odd tone. Um, and you could tell that it was not being well received in the room. The applause wasn't there. In his few poor jokes that he tried to make, not much laughter was there. And he was, yeah, I mean, he was saying, really, his interpretation of things was obviously a quite hard right Christian nationalist, whether these were his personal beliefs or not. That's what he was, the framing he was giving, saying that Europe basically had an enemy within, and that the enemy within was people who take a liberal approach, people who are trying to seek, a balance on migration, people who are trying to seek a balance on freedom of speech versus the rights of others, And he was making a lot of use of misinformation and disinformation, plucking a little case here and a little case there from different things that are happening in Europe at the moment, and saying that this was the biggest threat to European security on the same day or at the same moment almost that Russia was bombing a nuclear power plant in Europe, bombing Chernobyl again. It was like from something from another planet. And really, although he kept saying democracy, 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 he was really talking up, far right forces in Europe who haven't won any elections. And he was criticising things that European governments had done that were fully democratically supported. And so
Yeah,
it was,
I agree.
it was absolute doublespeak, and it was really frightening for the
I
future.
think that's the thing that I found most galling about the speech, is that although he presented it as a defense of democratic values and liberal principles, it clearly wasn't, if you know anything about his own politics and the particular cases that he was talking about. So you referred to a couple of specific instances he called out of what he thought was sort of overreach of the government into the rights of individuals. So he talked about the Adam Smith Connor case. This was a person, a physiotherapist, who was praying outside an abortion centre in Bournemouth and was basically arrested for that because there's a buffer zone law in the United Kingdom that says you're not allowed to do protests or vigils in the immediate vicinity of abortion clinics. And he picks that out as an example of sort of the free speech dying in the United Kingdom. He said that he was most worried about the United Kingdom of all of European nations because of incidents like this. And when you look into it, this guy was given 1 hour and 40 minutes to go away before he was arrested. He was engaged in very long conversation with the police officer. These laws are extraordinarily popular with the public. Talk about the democratic mandate. The local council polled residents of that area to see if they wanted a buffer zone law, and 75% of them, according to the BBC, were in favour of that law. So this is a very popular law put in place by appropriate democratic mechanisms. This person refused to follow the law and so was arrested. And JD Vance says, well, that's liberalism dead in the United Kingdom. It's bizarre.
I think there are particular links between sort of, extreme, whatever you want to call them, extreme or far right or, fundamentalist Christian nationalists in the UK and in the US. I mean, there's a bridge there, it's a funding bridge and a personnel bridge, and there's traffic across the Atlantic to go to each other's conferences, and, American NGOs of this Christianity exporting kind set up UK NGOs to mirror each other. And so I think that it's natural that he'd be most familiar with those examples, and it's an attempt in the Anglosphere, I suppose, in the English-speaking world, to, have a common front for Christian nationalist people to have a common front against the freedoms of others, essentially. So I think that might be why he was so obsessed with the UK. I mean, the UK has, is not unusual in the European region with the laws that it has, because, apart from the United States, in which there are large numbers of people who are sort of, as it were, free speech fundamentalists, in most of the free world, the democratic world, everyone recognises that the human right to freedom of expression has to be balanced in light of the rights and freedoms of others. And it is a legitimate curtailment of my right to express my views on abortion, that I shouldn't be able to harass women who are accessing healthcare on that basis in the immediate region. I mean, that's a perfectly acceptable balance to most people in Europe, to most people in the democratic world. Would think that was an acceptable balance. And of course, people like JD Vance also believe in limits on free speech. He wouldn't like to be libelled, I'm sure. He wouldn't like to have people standing outside his bedroom window shouting 24 hours a day. He wouldn't like people following him around 6 inches from his face with a sign saying, "You're a Christian fascist," all over, when he's going about his normal business. So he too believes in limitations on freedom of expression. No one really believes in completely untrammeled freedom of expression all the time. So I think it's the hypocrisy of the statement, as well as the detached, out of touch way that he was speaking, but also the fact that he was wrong. These are not the biggest, even were these things to be bad and not good, and I think they're good, and you do too, these balances, even if they were bad, are they worse than Russia on the borders of Europe? I mean, are they really, compared with Russia, the biggest challenge that European security faces? Absolutely, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yes. I think there's a number of things you said there that I think are worth stressing. The first being that last point, which is that people may disagree about the legitimacy of things like buffer zone legislation. It is very controversial within American politics, and there are some jurisdictions that have it and some jurisdictions that don't. I happen to have lived in the States for a long time. I remember the sorts of protests that would happen outside Planned Parenthood facilities, and they were perpetual. There were always large groups of people outside with placards trying to engage very aggressively anyone who went in, following their cars, trying to talk to them through their windows, making people feel very uncomfortable. And I'm happy that we don't allow that sort of thing in the United Kingdom, but I can see someone with a sort of free speech fundamentalist perspective saying no, even if it makes people very uncomfortable. The right to freedom of speech is so important that it overwrites all other concerns. And I can sort of understand that position, but you have to respect, you would think the vice president of a country would understand that different nations are going to come to different understandings of the balance between different freedoms, and that your country might do something one way, other countries might do something another way, and that doesn't represent the complete destruction of liberal norms and values. So there's one thing, which is that it just seems wildly inappropriate for a supposedly allied nation to speak in this way to its
Yeah.
allies who are
He
doing
wasn't
things
really
slightly
speaking up
differently.
for liberalism. He wasn't really speaking up for liberalism, though, was he? I mean, I don't think
No,
there was not real reading of his speech that made him speaking up for liberalism. It
I
was a
think that
hard read.
that's the thing you say about the
Yeah.
hypocrisy, which is he presents it as a defense of liberal values while he's the vice president of definitely the most illiberal
Mm.
president in, well, in my lifetime in the United States, certainly your lifetime too, basically the same age. That he is serving the agenda of a president who is rapidly undermining speech freedoms for people in the United States, scrubbing websites of government departments in the US of mention of, women who did amazing things, people of color have done amazing things, LGBTQ plus people who've done amazing things, very supportive of things like book bans on books that mention the existence of queer people and might be read by teenagers and things like that. So he's part of a political movement that is actively hostile to the expression of speech in his own country. He's certainly one who has promoted election conspiracies. And of course, Trump is the conspiracy theorist in chief of saying that the last Democratic election for president was not a proper election when we all know it actually was. So he's part of a political movement that's actively undermining liberal norms and values in his own country, coming to Europe where these, despite challenges, I think those values are more secure in Britain and
Yeah.
Germany and France than they are in the United States, lecturing us about how we should do things.
Yeah,
How
and
very
bigging up.
rude.
I know exactly, and I don't think he's just part of a domestic national US movement that is illiberal, anti-democratic, and all the rest of what you've said. He's part of a global movement too. I mean, the people he was bigging up. I believe he met with the German far right party representatives from the AfD while he was there. Of course, Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, was invited to the inauguration. These connections are global; they're not just national. So he's part of a global anti-liberal movement. And even in his speech, he was saying things that fitted into that playbook, like, for example, criticizing migration into Europe
Yes.
for the attacks that some individual migrants have made on people, murderous attacks, very, very awful crimes, but which nonetheless are events with complicated causes that don't just get caused by migration, while 99.9% of migrants don't drive cars into people. So it was bigoted, it was misinformed, it was illiberal, it was really shocking. I'm still shocked by it, and it was terrible because the Sky News guy afterwards had to try and, whether he had to or not, he did sort of just try and make sense of this as if it were a normal thing. He said,
Yes.
well, so you see this shocking speech, you just think, I can't believe that this, the global nationalist hard right playbook is being played out in this way in Munich, for goodness sake. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
historical ironies in Munich, and then you still couldn't make sense of it. A few seconds after, thinking what has just happened, and then the Sky News guy is like, "Well, that's the Vice President of the United States there making some point to the European," as it was all normal. And I felt like what he should have said was, "Wow, this is an unprecedented statement here, drawing on far-right conspiracy theories from across the world, and misinformed, and some of the analysis, obviously, since then has done so. But it just worries me. I don't watch American news that often because I now think, well, I can't do anything about it, so why would I, poison my system with having to learn about these things? And I can control only my reactions, and nothing else. So let me take away the source of the trouble, which is American news. Not all the time. I mean, one needs to be relatively informed to be an active citizen and all the rest of the things that we've talked about before. But I'm taking a little bit of a self-protective approach in some of this American news. But I did watch that speech and think, gosh, this is really bad. These developments are really bad. And when you do then dip back into American news and see what's happening, and see the way in which the institutions of government in the US are either being hollowed out or ideologically captured, it's actually very alarming.
I agree. It is alarming, and it feels like a breakdown of certainly the alliance between the United States and Europe in terms of the sorts of. It does feel like, although the language that Vance used was one of shared values, like we all have the same values, but you're not upholding them well enough, and you should do better.
You like civilization a lot
Right.
as well.
Yeah, Western civilization. You have to do more to defend Western
Our
civilization.
civilization.
It felt like a rupture where actually there is, I hesitate to use this word, but sort of an alien influence that has taken over the United States, is now speaking with the voice of the presidency of the United States, that is felt very unusual and strange. And you mentioned the peddling of far-right conspiracy theories. I mean, that was definitely in the talk he gave. He said, this is one of the things he said, last October, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses were in so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer in their own homes may amount to breaking the law. He said that in the speech. Now, the Scottish government has since confirmed that that's complete nonsense. And of course, it's complete nonsense. Anyone who knows anything about UK law and political culture would know that that's just not going to happen. But it was a far-right conspiracy theory that apparently came off TikTok. People have found the TikTok videos he probably watched to get the idea that was happening. And he's got form in that, because in just the vice presidential debate in the last election, he was citing TikTok hoaxes about Haitian immigrants eating cats in Ohio, which turned out to be fake. Yeah, that was him. And I remember my least favorite quote from him during the debate, when he was fact checked on that, was, the rules were that you were not going to fact check. So this is a person who has no care for the truth. He doesn't care that what he says is false and easily proven to be false, and yet he's lecturing other democratic governments about their defense of liberal norms and values. And one of those values is trying, when you're a public official at the very least, to not say obviously false things to get a political point. And it's horrifying, really. And I guess you made,
Well, to make it a bit more parochial, of course, it was also JD Vance who 2 weeks ago, when he was speaking at the so-called Religious Freedom Summit in Washington, which a lot of otherwise well-intentioned people from other parts of the world attended. I hope they spoke out against this. But when he was giving his speech there, he accused Humanist International, which is the global humanist group, of spreading atheism with Biden government money across the world. And what he was actually no, not if only. We don't want that, but not to spread atheism. But he was actually talking about programs that help human rights defenders and trained humanist human rights defenders in different parts of the world. And he, again, lied and said that it was to spread atheism. I mean, and we're in their sights too. I think that's the important thing, is that it's not just that the other minorities and general liberals that they're they're coming for. They are definitely coming for the non-religious too, and I think that's true obviously within the US, and it's true with the alliances that they're building outside the US. I think there's two more things that I would say about it as a general phenomenon. The first, of course, is that, well, actually, they might succeed.
Yes.
You know, there are European countries that could go this way. There could be elections in many countries that would go this way, and that would, you know, it's not beyond some governments already in Europe are Trump-like. You know, the US is only the latest Western country to go this way. If you think about something like Hungary, it already has long ago. So that's a problem. Yeah, that's a worry, is that this could work, that they could succeed. And, you know, we should definitely be worried about that. And so I think that that conclusion naturally is us to think what we can do about it. And in that connection, my heart was warmed this week with an interview that was given by President Macron of France, who said, I believe in the humanism of the Renaissance and of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It made us who we are. I believe it can still succeed. And I thought, I felt so happy, because it's been so long since any Western leader really said, you know, in big terms, you know, these sorts of things. I suppose Keir Starmer gave a speech just after he was elected Prime Minister about, you know, universal dignity and the human rights of every person and so on. But at the civilizational level, and because I do agree with one of the things that JD Vance said, is that the civilization that was generated by this region, or I think it was influenced by places all over the world, it would be silly to call it Western civilization as such, but the civilization that is currently embedded in the foundations of the liberal democratic institutions of the Western world is important, and is, you know, should be defended, and is a great basis for human happiness and welfare and prosperity and freedom and progress. Not his version of it, because his version is, you know, nonsense. But there is a version of it which should be defended. So the question is, how do we defend it? So that's the first of the last two observations that I personally want to make about it. You know, how do we rally round the Macron types and the Starmer and the week after he's elected types that say, no, come on, you know, liberalism, freedom, you know, balancing rights, but everyone having them. These are the ways, you know, to make progress as a society. And then secondly, how do we take on some of the actual threats that our societies do face in terms of free speech and others, while not falling into the trap of Vance-like hard right populism? That just this week, another man, second man in as many weeks, was charged with a crime as a result of burning a Quran. Now, the first man, who was a couple of weeks ago charged, pleaded guilty, and so we never got to see how the case would actually play out in court. I understand that the man who burnt this Quran outside the Turkish embassy, I believe, or consulate, he's, as far as we know, as far as coverage has indicated, is clearly not guilty. So we will see some sort of trial. Now, that worries me as a supporter of freedom of expression and a believer in freedom of expression being untrammeled until it starts to hurt people, because obviously burning a Quran doesn't hurt anybody, apart from in the most trivial sense of offence, you know, which has to generally be allowed in a free society unless it amounts to constant harassment, I think. You know, it's the right side of the line, just mere offence. And that is a worry. So, you know, I worry about that, but in worrying about that and in some of the other illiberal things that do happen in our societies, I don't want to be hitched to the JD Vance, you know, Christian nationalist, hard right populist bandwagon. And so I do worry as well that, as well as finding a way of expressing, like Macron does, the real basis of our civilization, humanism, the Enlightenment, liberalism, and all the rest of it, which we need to do, we also need to find ways to call out and address these genuine erosions of freedom that are occurring within our societies, without, you know, allowing the people who, like me, would worry about that to end up then corralled into the far right, because they're the only ones who are talking about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's quite difficult too. And I don't know how you feel about this. I find it very difficult to talk about burning of Qurans because, of course, Muslims as a minority in England, at least, there's lots of evidence they face, of course, extreme prejudice. There's lots of prejudice against Muslims, discrimination against Muslims in the economy, in society, in politics, you know, all sorts of places. And so you always fear when talking about something like the burning of a Quran to add fuel to that sort of fire of prejudice. You have to find ways of being very careful to say, you know, absolutely want to condemn any deliberate or racist provocation of Muslims. I believe in this case it was a ex-Muslim who burnt his Quran. I'm not completely sure about that, but that has been the case, of course, in other parts of the world as well. So it's often not white far-right racists who are doing this. It's often people who are doing it for some sort of, very personal reason of apostasy or whatever. So you do, but you do. It's difficult to find ways to talk about that. But I think we need to find ways, as well as defending the real basis of the civilization that we enjoy. We also need to find ways of calling out some of the potential erosions that do exist, in order to address them, because they should be addressed, but also in order not to end up giving comfort to the far right inadvertently.
I think you're absolutely right with both of those points. I think that it is difficult the truth is, managing a multicultural society with people of many different beliefs, backgrounds, convictions is very difficult. And sometimes people's exercise of their legitimate freedoms will deeply offend other people. And finding where the line between, offense and harassment or whatever is can be very challenging. And sometimes I think we haven't got it right. And some of the things that we've currently, arrested people for, I do worry are becoming too heavy-handed. And I'm not sure that I want the government to have the right to do that. And true liberals and broadly liberal-minded people do need to be able to engage in those conversations and say, you know what? We do want to promote a multicultural society. We don't want anyone to feel marginalized. And at the same time, people have to be able to say and do things which deeply offend even minorities, right? And that is a difficult balance, but holding on to the fact that it's difficult, that democratic governance is complex, is really important, because the JD Vances of the world present it as if it's very easy, as if you can just, click your fingers and solve these problems by being on the right side of history, while they themselves, of course, fight against any speech that they don't want. I mean, I listened to his talk where he's saying, well, you European governments have to become comfortable with the expression of even extremist views that you might not like, that you might think are of as hate speech, and just can't help but see across the whole of the United States all sorts of targeted attacks on the rights of liberal groups to express their views in all sorts of contexts, and say, no, you don't practice what you preach at all. But there is a genuine complexity, and we do have to be honest about where it's difficult. Like even something like the case that Vance talked about of the man praying and being arrested, there is part of me that I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that, if I'm honest. I don't think it's wrong to have those laws, but I think that we should recognize that there is a tension there, and not be so, just so forceful about being like, no, lock them up. But recognize that actually it's a difficult thing to manage as a free society.
I think that's right, and we should certainly recognise that man's freedom of expression has been curtailed.
Yeah,
it's foolish to pretend it hasn't been. He has had his free expression curtailed. I'm sure we all know what it's like to be shut up when we don't want to be shut up. It's not a nice feeling, and it's very difficult when you're the person whose expression has been curtailed, to resign yourself to the fact, thinking, well, all right, it's because it's in favour of someone else's interests, especially as in his case, no doubt, he thinks that the other person whose interest it's in is basically a murderer, because obviously that's what he thinks about abortion. So I can absolutely understand, and do I sympathise? Maybe that's not the right word. I don't sympathise with. I can empathise. I think I can empathise with how he might feel, having been myself in other forums, silenced in the interest of another person and not liked it. And so I think you're right that we should be considerate to each other in that way, and not speak as if there are easy solutions. No, I think the more I think about it, I think what you've said is really very important, because you're right, the Vance type populists, easy solutions. Don't want people murdering people in Christmas markets, ban migration.
Yeah.
Don't allow anyone to say whatever they want ever near an abortion clinic, because that's just how it should be free speech. These are simplistic, stupid, really stupid ideas that don't deal with any of the complexity that exists in either of those very complex situations. And we shouldn't be those people. We should definitely be saying, this is very hard. You're right. This man who wants to pray, absolutely recognise that he believes that he's doing the right thing, that he believes he could be saving a life, and something he believes is a human life, and that he is expressing himself according to his inner conscience, and of course he feels terrible that is being curtailed. I think that's right. And then hope to talk to him about the balance between the two. I remember this happening in practice back in 2006. Was it 2006 or 2010? Whichever, either the Equalities or the Equality Act was going through, and being present at a very interesting discussion between representatives of the then Muslim Council of Britain, which was quite different from, well, that's changed a lot. But anyway, let's not talk about the whole institution. The guy who was there from the Muslim Council of Britain was himself, as an individual, quite liberal and understanding. And he talked with someone from Stonewall. And they were talking about the regulations that were then going through about the prohibition of harassment on the grounds of religion or belief, and the prohibition of harassment on the grounds of sexual orientation. And the way that they, tried to understand each other, and in the end came to a common understanding that, sometimes our right to do as we would like to do in relation to other people, say what we would like to say, and so on, has to be curtailed in the interests of that other person's rights. It was quite good. It was interesting.
That's hopeful.
Yeah, because I remember them saying, "Well, I see what you mean. If I want protection as a Muslim, then how can I deny you protection as a lesbian or whatever?" And it was a very fruitful conversation. And obviously, the more conversations we can have like that, where we recognise that each other's rights are very fragile, and we can only protect them if we protect all of them, I think that would be fruitful. I think some schools do. I mean, I've seen that taught quite well in some citizenship lessons, the idea of the balancing of rights. But I think it isn't a concept that's widely socialised, in our media or in people's general thoughts about how the world is. Because people tend to think in terms of right and wrong, legal and illegal, good and bad, and not sort of think about the way we balance and calibrate
And I think
competing demands.
I feel that's part of the liberal project, is actually to get people to recognise that. Yes, the humanist project, to recognise the complexity of people's competing interests, and that very often we can come to a settlement that's good for everybody, but not always. And sometimes we have to make difficult decisions, and different polities may make decisions that are slightly different to each other but still be broadly acceptable.
Absolutely.
And others are not acceptable. But the sort of intervention that Vance made, filled with misinformation and this black and white view of the world, is so unhelpful for advancing that conversation. And I guess that brings me on to what I think should be our last kind of point about this topic, is that you mentioned Macron giving a speech about humanism and the Enlightenment. Very exciting. I'll look that up. But I felt
interviewing the FT.
Okay, I'll look for the interview. I felt that the response to this, although some people have said how outraged they are, particularly from like the British government, like our ambassador to the United States, our foreign secretary, it has been a bit feeble, honestly, and a bit supine. And I kind of hope for that Love Actually moment of kind of standing up to America and saying, this is disgraceful, you're undermining democratic norms in your own country, you're spewing far-right conspiracy theories, what nonsense you're talking, JD Vance. Like, why isn't anyone willing to just say to their face what we all know, which is he's a liar and he's a conspiracy theorist and he doesn't know anything about what he's talking about because he keeps coming out with nonsense that hasn't happened? Why can't our politicians say that?
Well, the Liberal Democrat Party said it very strongly this weekend. They were very good, actually. They were the first. Well, I'm sure Greens did it too. Individual politicians did it, but the leadership of the Liberal Democrat Party said it very loudly. I was quite impressed by that. They got to grips with the essence of this problem and analysed it well. And then Ed Davies said, this is illiberal, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and all. And he did very well. But I mean.
But they're not in government, right? So, I mean, that's great. But we have a government we elected to represent our interests, and it feels like
so if you say
they're not pushing back, and they're not articulating the sort of inspiring vision of a liberal society that we're talking about. That's my feeling.
I agree. Macron is, of course. I don't think any government really ever does what you say democratically. I mean, even the UK government, when it talks to China, won't talk seriously about the genocide of the Uyghurs or anything else. And I think that is a problem. Why does it happen? Well, it happens pretty obviously. I mean, because no longer are human rights and democratic norms if they ever were, prized as one of the highest aims of international cooperation. I mean, we're a long, long way from that. It have been for some time. This is not unusual that a Western government doesn't call out anti-democratic practices and so on in the government of another country to which they have deep economic and social ties. It's how it always is, unfortunately.
Well, I declare myself unimpressed and disappointed with my own government in its response to this. I
But you
feel
must
like,
have been disappointed for quite some time. I
oh
mean,
yeah, I've been
you know,
disappointed for ages, Andrew. I'm perpetually
yes.
disappointed.
When you must try and look for something. I mean, the roots of your disappointment, I suppose, is that you believe in the multilateral system and that you believe that the United Nations and its various treaties mean something. And so you expect governments to call each other out when they fail to live
Yeah,
up to the treaties they signed.
I
But that's
do.
never that's never happened, though. So,
I'm a bit of an idealist like that, but I just want someone to tell the truth. I'm so sick of
yeah,
these bullshit artists freely bullshitting from pulpits of
yeah,
extraordinary influence and no one saying, wait a minute, this is
yeah.
bollocks. Everything you're saying is a lie.
Yeah.
It frustrates me.
Did the Chancellor of Germany not say something to this effect recently?
I think I
Like
think he
yesterday,
said that
speech.
it was unacceptable to
Yeah.
relate to suggest that European countries were like Soviet countries, which is one of the things
Oh,
that
yeah.
Vance sort of suggested. But even that I think is a bit weak. Like, okay, yeah, it's unacceptable, but call out what they're doing. They are literally tearing the foundations of American democracy apart, and they have been doing it for years. And Vance has been right at the center of that project. He is a profound threat himself to American democracy and to liberal norms in the United States. And all my liberal American friends understand that. And it would be nice, I guess, to have their back a little bit and say, who the hell are you to talk to us about this?
Yeah. Well, I agree, of course. I'm
Okay,
just not disappointed because I don't
you're
expect
just
it to
not,
have.
you just expect this. Let's talk about something more fun. How about that for a segue?
Yay.
Let's talk about Darwin Day. So it was just Darwin Day. If people don't know what Darwin Day is, it is a annual celebration recognition of Darwin's birthday on the 12th of February, which is obviously the date on which he was born. And Humanists UK in particular holds a major event to celebrate that day. And Andrew, how about you tell us about the event in general and what happened this year?
Well, yeah, I was thinking actually recently, we don't, this week, we don't push Darwin Day quite as much as we used to. I mean, I remember when I first started working in Humanists UK, whenever it was, a long time ago, there was a big push to have it as a national holiday, 12th of February as a national holiday to celebrate Darwin and British science generally, because
That would be
um,
sweet.
it would be good. Yeah, I know, exactly right. So I don't know why we stopped campaigning for it. It's February, is very, dark. You could do with a bank holiday. We don't have many bank holidays in this country compared with other countries anyway. And, we could do with it. We don't have any bank holiday that celebrates something like the extraordinary British achievements in science and discovery, of course, of which Darwin is the great exemplary representative. And we used to push for that. We should push for it again. I think it's not just the UK, of course. The American Humanist Association has had various proclamations in various states of Darwin Day and so on. So I think a lot of people do push it. The idea of Darwin Day being not to sort of sanctify Darwin himself, who was a human being with flaws and fissures and weaknesses, as well as great strengths and great achievements, but to have an occasion to recognise the enormous world-changing discovery that there was no need for a creation, and that at last, in the 19th century, we had an answer to the question of how human beings could have arisen and all life could have arisen and diversified in the way that it has. So this, of course, the principle of evolution of natural selection, by the process of natural selection, is mind-blowing, is groundbreaking, is worldview altering, now as then. Even now, when people learn about it for the first time, which does still happen, I think, particularly of people who leave quite high control religions, of whom I meet a large number, and when they learn sort of about how actually how things came to be the way they are. It's sort of mind-blowing moment, just as it was when it was first uncovered by Darwin and others in the 19th century. And so this date is chosen as an opportunity to promote that, remind everyone of that, celebrate it, because of course it was an amazing thing to suddenly be able to make sense of ourselves in this world, and not to have to come up with, sort of made up explanations for how things had come to be the way they are, and to promote the importance of science as well as a way of understanding the world. So it should be a bank holiday. There should be stamps every year, Darwin stamps full of finches, turtles, and
Yes. They could
tortoises
change
and
slightly every year, just imperceptibly.
absolutely, exactly. Yeah, very nice, very nice. As a result of which ones were bought the most. Could they
Yeah,
change?
that would be
Yeah, exactly.
amazing. We're going to pitch this
Success
to the Royal Mail.
selected. Yes, good idea.
So I think you
And
said
that's
some
why we do it.
important things there. That first, this isn't about worshipping Darwin, right? There is some in
No,
some quarters of particularly Christian
he was a
apologetics.
fun man in lots of ways.
He was a absolutely rollicking human being, as
Yeah,
far as we can tell.
I think so.
But it's not about worshipping him. Humanists do not worship humanity in general. Do not worship single individuals. It's not elevating Darwin to the status of some
Even the
sort of
ones with the
prophet.
big white beard. Yeah, no.
Right, exactly. Yes, he's not become Methuselah or something in our metaphysics.
That's right.
He's just another guy, but it's honoring his scientific achievements, and particularly I loved how
Yeah,
you said it's answering the question of where we came from. It's providing an origin story for humankind, something that human beings have been trying to do for millennia in religious
yeah, forever.
stories. And this one not only has the benefit of being true and supported by huge amounts of all sorts of different evidence, but in my view is actually way better as a narrative. It's actually more intricate, more interesting than anything any religion came up with to explain how we got here. You can take 7 days, right, and throw it in the bin, because evolution is much more exciting a story. The fact that we are literally related to all other life on Earth,
I think
and
that's amazing.
yeah, it's actually spiritually, I sometimes use this word, uplifting and exciting, and to think about the power that it gives us to understand the past, to look back into history and to see how everything changed so slowly over time from what it was then to what it is now, like the tiniest things becoming all the amazing diversity that we see around us, and the way that we can trace the tree back.
Mm.
It's just extraordinary, and that is so much better than dust and mud and blood and all the other
Well, it's,
ideas that religions had.
I mean, I agree particularly with two things that you said. One is that it being suddenly an explanation that works and makes sense, and I think that is very important because, of course, before Darwin, there were lots of people who didn't believe in gods. Didn't believe in the religion that they had maybe grown up with, especially in Europe. Didn't believe in God. Didn't find that very probable. But they did have a bit of a problem because they couldn't explain the universe or the world. And David Hume had a bit of a go. He said, in one of his essays, I can't remember exactly where, he said, well, why should we think that something had to be created? A plant doesn't get created. A plant becomes, makes a seed that becomes another plant, and things just go on and on like that. So maybe why can't life just all be like that? Good try. And along the right lines, but he didn't have a way of explaining how that could happen in practice, and how it could have happened in practice and how it might still be happening now. Darwin gives us that, and I think makes it possible to be fully non-theistic in an intellectually satisfying way. You're not on the back foot anymore, in a way that some of those 18th century deists had to be. A lot of 18th century deists, had they lived a few decades later, would have been non-theists because evolution was available as an explanation. Or in their own writings, they often say, think about a Wollstonecraft or a Paine. Oh, well, yeah, probably it was all created somehow, but there's nothing happened since. It's the sort of line, and that's because they can't explain how
Yeah.
human beings arose otherwise. Post Darwin, you can explain it, and then of course cosmologically explain the universe later on, but you can explain it. So it really is like the final piece for a lot of. I always think of that. It's a sigh of relief that you must have as a non-theist once you find the theory of the reality of evolution. Oh, thank goodness there is. Yeah, I thought so, and now I know that there is.
There is an explanation after all.
There is an explanation. And the second thing you said, which I think is so absolutely right, is what a wonderful feeling, understanding natural selection and evolution and human beings' place in it is. It's so wonderful to think that this earth is our home, that we're completely native to it, that we're connected, like you say, to every other creature. This dog on my lap is so close to me, not just emotionally and physically, but biologically, and really, and it just makes so much sense of everything that we feel when we have that feeling of connection to the natural world. Whether you're enjoying rain on your face or the green of a forest, or watching the insects, or listening to the bird song, or being with your dog, or lying in the grass, whatever it might be. It just is it's a beautiful part of a worldview to have that, not only to feel that connection to the whole of the world, but to understand that it's real, and even why you might feel that, because you are part of it. It literally is you. I think that's a very can be not for everyone, but for me anyway, and can be for others, a very profound and moving experience, that sense of at-homeness in the web of life that we're part of on this world. And Darwin gave us a way of feeling that, but making sense of that too.
There's something really profound about that it provides a sense of connection with all other life and with the cosmos in which we live, which shaped life. Because it's not just evolution isn't just a theory of life, but it's a theory of how the context in which life arises and develops shapes life. And so we're almost like, I don't know, like I'm not going to give a good metaphor. Something like a record that's constantly being drawn on by the world around us over time and being shaped into something else. And there's something, I think there's something very beautiful about that in comparison to many traditional religious perspectives that say, no, humanity is something separate from the rest of creation and special. And I guess sometimes people worry that this has been a constant worry of many religious people across many generations, that the theory of evolution diminishes humanity, that it says, oh, we're just another animal, just another part of the world. There's nothing special about us in the sense that we weren't selected by God for a special role. And since we're just another animal, sometimes the argument goes, well then, why should we consider human beings any more important than an ant or a mollusk or something like that? Or even a rock, if we're just a part of the world, like we're just a natural thing.
I always think is a weird ethical leap.
I think it's weird. It is weird.
Yeah, because you could argue it completely the other way. You could say, if we're connected to everything else, then shouldn't we look after everything? Look after ourselves. Look after just, it would be easy to do it the other way. As indeed, in a way, that is what's happened. Of course, is that post-Darwin, especially, the circle of our ethical sympathies has expanded way beyond. So yes, you're right. Critics of this should look at it the other way. They should see how, since we have accepted, as we began to in the 19th century, that human beings are just part of, not a separate creation, as you say, but just part of a web of life. We've become much more caring for other animals, because we realise they're just other animals and we're animals too.
Yes.
And the natural world in general, and so on and so forth. And I think Darwin must have felt this too. There's this, I think it's in his book on emotions in man and animals, where he, it's one of the books, thinking, which I think he wrote it quite late in his life, when he really just ends forever the idea that human beings are separate. So he's already sort of said, obviously we can have evolved through the same natural processes, but in this he makes it really clear the continuities that exist between humans and other animals, and the expression of emotions is one of them. And he talks about his father's dog, who always became distressed when his father got his suitcase down, or the servants did probably, when the suitcases came out, because the dog knew that meant that his father was leaving, and his dog hated it when his father left, and it began to show emotion in the face. And I think he must have been such a wonderful, sensitive man, Darwin, in lots of ways, and we know that he was, in fact, with his own family in many ways. But anyway, just that observation. And that's why what makes him a genius, of course, is that people had known that about dogs for many centuries, ever since we domesticated the dog. Presumably, they'd observed these sorts of behaviours and the signs of emotion in them and in other animals too. But he really puts it together and expresses it as part of this continuity, pointing out that we have for him, obviously, it's because we've got a common origin that he can connect us in that way. But this is an ethically better way of looking at things. I think this is, well, let me rephrase that, because that implies something I don't want to imply. This is a better foundation, a surer foundation for good ethics than the idea that we're a special creation. So I think, contrary to those people who think that we can only behave morally if we think we're somehow divine, have a divine spark in us, I think it's the opposite. I think we're more likely to behave well if we realise that we've got a biological origin. That's what I think.
Your point that our treatment of other animals, non-human animals, has actually improved since the discovery of the theory of evolution, I think is a really powerful one. It speaks against the idea that's often expressed that humanism is humanocentric, or in a bad way, speciesist, right? Is often the worry that people have, focuses on human concerns to the exclusion of non-human animals, when in fact the expansion of broadly humanistic values has been one of the main drivers of ethical consideration of non-human animals, in part because it has shown our relationship to them. It's helped us to appreciate how similar we actually are. It is, right-wing Christians who are like, my parents were not apes, who are very, very against the link between humankind and non-human animals. It's more humanistic thinkers who like to say, no, actually, our ancestors were some common ancestor of today's apes and bonobos and things like that.
I suppose that's even true today. If you think about Peter Singer or Martha Nussbaum, and true in the past of, Jeremy Bentham, who said, the question is not can they think, but can they suffer? These are all non-theistic people who, as a result, well, they're all humanists actually, as you say, who as a result care about other animals as well. I think that you're onto something there.
Well, I think there's something about the removal of the idea that human beings have a soul and therefore are especially created with a special power within us to have certain sort of experiences or to apprehend the world in a particular way, which means that we are fundamentally different from every other animal. And once you get rid of that and say, no, we're kind of all related and in many ways on sort of different scales of ability to perceive the world and to experience different sorts of emotional feelings and things like that, then you have to start contending with a much more complex ethical landscape. And it does, as you say, it makes sense of our everyday relationship with the natural world. Everyone has experiences of seeing a pet and intuiting that pet has emotional responses similar to their own emotional responses. That makes very little sense under some theistic understandings of humankind, where human beings were the ones, blessed with self-knowledge and feelings and rationality and things like that. But I can tell you from how my dog gets a treat out of me every time she wants one, that there's some sort of rationality going on in there. They have some sort of appreciation of cause and effect that they're working on. And so it's...
I want to ask a question.
Yes.
If there was a fire in a building and you could go in and save one person and you had to choose between your dog, would you like to reveal the name of your dog?
Ella.
Ella.
She's just outside. I can hear her pattering around.
So, Ella, and she's a very beautiful dog.
She is.
By the way. And you have to go into a burning building. You can save either her or some random man that you don't know and never met and everything.
That's a terrible thing to ask.
I know. But I'm trying to push this a little bit further, given what you just said. Who would you save?
I would have to. I hope Colton, my husband, never watches this. I'd have to save the person, but I would feel.
But you would you? How easy is that? How easy is that decision?
Honestly, I think
that's honestly what you would do. It's what you'd like to do.
Yeah,
it's what you'd want to.
No, I think it is honestly what I would do.
Is it?
Yeah. I adore Ella, but I do think that I have to save a human being. But I would feel terrible about it, and I hope never to be put in that situation. And I hate that you asked me the question.
No, I know. Well, no, I think about it all the time. I think about this question all the time.
Oh, it's a bit grim.
Yeah, I'm not like all the time obsessively, but I often think about this question. If Juno and some random human being were in a burning building, I could only save one. because it does illustrate, you know, that, well, it's interesting to think about if you're interested in thinking about whether human beings are qualitatively different from all other animals. We spent a lot of time saying how connected we all are to other animals and how all other animals are on a continuity. Um, and then we've also said that humanists aren't speciesist, which I think is true. And yet we both think as humanists that the right answer to our question is to save the human being.
Yes.
So we do think there is something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
I
a
do
good point. I mean,
that
but
is.
that's not to say that things exist on a scale, and we will probably have to do a different episode to really pull this apart, but to say that human beings are on a kind of scale of moral value or moral consideration or something compared to non-human animals is not to say that there's no difference. There is a difference. It's just not a category difference. It's a difference of degree, right? And I think that there's ways of working that out that, I mean, I think intuitively everyone appreciates it would be wrong to let a baby die over like a prawn or a clam. I think people appreciate that quite immediately. And there are good
Well, indeed they
naturalistic
do.
reasons you can give for that don't require invoking a soul, like the capacity of a
Yeah,
clam
I'm
to
not
suffer
interested in
versus a,
souls. No, I
yeah.
agree.
So I think that there are good naturalistic arguments to make that distinction. But I really I take your point. I mean, there's nothing in the charge of speciesism that
No.
is leveled towards humanism. And you mentioned Peter Singer earlier. I understand that he now prefers the word personist. He doesn't like to use the term humanist for himself because he thinks that it is speciesist. And he has a very particularly strong view of animal rights. So, there's something for us to explore there, maybe in a future episode. But I guess for now,
It's,
it is enough to say, I think we both agree about this, that if you think that accepting the theory of evolution as fact, which it is a fact, means that you relegate human beings to insignificance because of their biological
mm,
origins and
mm,
they weren't specially created, that is a philosophical mistake and a weird
mm.
mistake to make, because actually, as you put it so well, you can actually see it as elevating all of life to the same sort of status that we should have for ourselves and the same sort of consideration. And that's a much more enlivening and beautiful perspective.
Yes, and I would also recommend to anyone listening not to get trapped in a burning building with Juno, because the odds are I'm probably going to save her.
And yeah, I hope that Ella hasn't been listening to our conversation. Ella, I definitely save you in a burning building. You don't worry. She'd be able to get out
Oh,
herself. She's very
knew
fast
it.
and nimble.
Yeah, she's clever in
Yeah,
her person.
I say,
Human.
it's an expression of the values as you put it that I hope that I would live into, not necessarily the ones that I actually would. And there are good evolutionary explanations for that as well.
Of course, that's true. That's true.
Well, Andrew, this has been a very fruitful discussion. I hope people have enjoyed it. If you have, hit the like and subscribe button. We're going to have many more of these conversations in the future, and I'll see you in the depths. I love saying that.